Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. We're coming to you live from Signature Bank at Edison Park, kicking off our third annual Signature Bank AM 560 Business Tour. We'll be talking to one of the founders of Signature Bank at the top of the 8 o'clock hour. And we'll be talking a little bit more about the mayoral election today at the bottom of the 8 o'clock hour with Bob Fioretti, one of the candidates on the ballot today. But you've had Bernie Goldberg, Shell Atkinson, and now Lara Logan. Very interesting. I saw this interview that Lara Logan, who I think everybody will remember from 60 Minutes.
She was with CBS for some 16 years,
yeah,
right?
Correct. Foreign correspondent for CBS News. But that 60 Minutes, I think, gave her real profile, understandably. I still watch 60 Minutes. She gave this interview to a former Navy SEAL, Mike Ritland, on a podcast that he does, talking about the press, talking about the Jill Abramson book that's coming out that we've discussed, the former New York Times executive editor, talking about the New York Times protocol with Trump coverage, and just a whole host of things. But she made some admissions that I think jarred people, even though most, I think, even casual observers and readers and consumers of the news recognize the veracity of what she's saying, for example.
I didn't even notice that there was a bias in the media. People would say it to me all the time, and I argued passionately and ferociously against that, because I really believe that, you know, when we do it well, and the majority of serious journalists will all trying to do their best to overcome those biases and rely on the facts and good systems. You know what? You know, we have few conventions, if you like, because they're not really rules, but that you need at least two first-hand sources for something, right? Those things help keep you, keep your work to a certain standard. Those standards are out the window. I mean, you read one story after another or hear it, and it's all based on one anonymous administration official, a former administration official, right? I mean, that's not journalism. That's sorry, that is absolute horror.
Lara Logan working blue.
And it was a 3.5 hour interview. It was great. It was fascinating.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff here, and this is why we reached out to have her on the show, and we're pleased to be joined now by former CBS News foreign correspondent Lara Logan. Lara, thanks for being with us. Appreciate it.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me.
Please, if you could keep the profanity to a minimum. This is a family show.
I'll do my best.
How has it been since you've sort of started saying things that seem to be patently obvious about the media, like it leans left and like there's a political agenda, and there's been a lot of reporters, not all, a lot of reporters that have seemed to cross over from being a journalist to being a political activist. What's the response been from your former friends?
Well, it's been a little busier than I expected it to be because, you know, I'm used to speaking my mind and nobody paying attention. That's what happens most often in my house anyway. But quite honestly, I really have not had a lot of pushback. In fact, I haven't had any pushback really from my colleagues and from my friends who are also journalists. Most people they know it's true, right? And anyway, what are they going to do? Push back and say, we're not liberal? We're really conservatives?
Well, Laura, when did you realize that the mainstream media had an agenda? Was there an aha moment that you
put
had?
It like that, I'm not so sure that it's a monolithic agenda, and I'm not so sure that it belongs to the mainstream media either. My experience has been more that that my point in saying that, you know, most journalists are registered Democrats is just to acknowledge who we are. You know, not to say that there's, just because you're a registered Democrat and a journalist, you can't be honest and professional and independent, because of course you can. It's more the fact that we've departed from the standards and the norms that, and my experience as an old school journalist, they always defined us. And it's one thing to be a conservative commentator or a liberal commentator, or to come out as a newspaper and identify on one side of the political spectrum, or as a show But what we're doing is we're pretending to be in the middle. We're pretending to be objective when we really are on one side of the political spectrum, and in this case, it just happens to be on the left. That's my issue, and I realized it personally when I was confronted by a group of, if you like, people protesting against abortion, or I said pro-life once, and someone attacked me even for using that term. And they said to me, "You're not fair to us," and it bothered me. It kind of stuck in my head, even though I defended the media. And for years, I thought about this until I realized, wow, they're actually kind of right. Every time we put them on television, it's because there's an abortion clinic that's been bombed, or we do it in sort of pejorative terms about someone who's on that side of the political spectrum. And it was one of the things that made me question and open my eyes a little.
Yeah, I mean, I think your point about just be honest about who you are, pretending to be in the middle when you're decidedly not, is the thing that's the most frustrating to me. And the way that I always talk to my journalist friends about this, and we've looked up voting records here in Chicago. I've done it, looked up voting records of like the top 100 journalists, and it's 90-10 Democrat, Republican in terms of primary ballots cast. So I mean, let's just be honest about it. My question always back to them. Look, if you had in the D.C. press corps, 90% of the Gang of 500, as it's called, were Republican voters. They voted consistently for the Republican candidate for president. Do you think the coverage would be different? And of course it would be. And it doesn't mean that it's unprofessional, and it doesn't mean that it's bad. It just means be honest about it. Understand that you're coming to the table with a perspective. You have beliefs. You're not these superhuman beings that have no belief systems and no disposition. And so just be frank about that so that people can understand that perspective and factor that into what they consume.
Well, what you're talking about is context, right?
Yeah, right.
I mean, that's what we want. I mean, if I go out on Afghanistan and report on something without any context for people to understand it, and an honest context, right, then that allows that report to be taken in isolation and to be used whatever way. So, I mean, what you're talking about is one of the most natural things in the world. Give people an honest context in which to evaluate the information they're being given. That's why identifying your sources is so important. And then, you two have probably been doing this as long as I have, right? I mean, so you're familiar with why we give anonymity. Typically, that's an exception. It's not the standard. It's not supposed to be the norm, right? We encouraged people to identify themselves, to go on the record as much as possible, and not to hide behind anonymity. I mean, really, that's supposed to be there to protect people whose lives might be at risk. Or, if the situation is extraordinary, the circumstances are exceptional, and you're not going to be able to, report on something that is of such significance unless the person has the protection of anonymity. But today, I mean, with the amount of anonymity for sources left and right, I mean, it's all over the place, and it's constant. What we're allowing people to do is people with, dishonest motivation are using the cloak of anonymity to push a political agenda. And that's a failure of journalism, and it's a failure of leadership. And then it becomes a failure of all of us when we just go along with it.
Right. I just wanted to ask you quickly about your time with CBS. How did it end? Why aren't you still with 60 Minutes?
Well, that's a very good question. Why didn't you ask them?
Okay.
Ask them. I loved my time at 60 Minutes. It was just, I can't say enough about it. The standard that the show works to and that the people there work to, and the amazing work that I was able to do while I was there. I'm very proud of it.
I want to pick up just talking about journalistic standards again. The Jussie Smollett hoax case and the press reporting on that, and frankly, some that are still sticking with the narrative they started with, which is Jussie Smollett's narrative. The lack of healthy skepticism, not cynicism, but just healthy skepticism of restrained reporting until and unless you get facts in that are verifiable and don't get out over your skis. And we've seen this before, right? I mean, the Jussie Smollett, the Virginia, the UVA rape case that Rolling Stone published, Duke Lacrosse, Covington schoolboys, and all this. Is there something that you see that has changed with the sort of narrative telling focus of the press as opposed to the fact gathering and reporting job that the press is supposed to fulfill?
Well, it's an interesting point that you raise, because what it smacks of to me is when journalists stand up today and say, there's never been a more important time for us to do our jobs, right? We have to hold those in power to account. And we have to be real journalists now. It's more important than ever. That always makes me wonder, what do you mean by that? Are you saying that if Hillary Clinton had won the election, it wouldn't have been as important to do our jobs properly? Are you saying it's more important because it's a Republican president and not a Democrat, and you don't agree with them or you don't like them? Or are you saying it's more important than it ever has been, Republican or Democrat, because of this president, because you really don't like him? I mean, as you can see, when you follow it to its logical conclusion, it becomes absolutely ridiculous. And in fact, many people have said to me, I think the opposite is true. When you like the person who's in power, when you agree with everything they're saying, it's more important to be critical, because we're inclined to believe the people we like and agree with. And you know, I'm not one of these journalists. I don't want to speak out of turn here. I haven't followed the Jussie Smollett case. And on a personal level, I feel bad for anyone who does something like that, who goes out and lies like that and is publicly humiliated, even if it is his own fault, which it appears to be. But on a journalistic level, I have to look at, here are all these journalists. They could have independently verified that story in a lot of different ways, starting with the police, who seemed to be extremely skeptical right from the very beginning.
Yes.
And it's not the only story that fits the pattern where, you know, MAGA hats are involved, or people on one side of the political spectrum are involved, and the vast majority of journalists, you know, dancing on the grave of a narrative that they don't like, are rushing to judgment on the other side. I mean, there's a great irony in it, and it serves to prove my point. If you like the person and you agree with what they're saying, doesn't make them right. You have to be as critical of them as the people you don't like and don't agree with. And that's why I always say I do my job the same way no matter who's in power. I did my job the same way under when Clinton was in power, and Bush, and Obama, and Donald Trump. I mean, for me, it's all the same. There's only one truth. I approach everything with an open mind and an open heart, and I'm as skeptical of the people I like as the ones I don't.
See, I've always started from the premise that, borrowing from Finley Peter Dunne, a Chicago writer, that the part of the job of the Fourth Estate is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. But I think what we've moved to in the 21st century, because of a hyper-politicized press, is what John McWhorter wrote about in The Atlantic in the wake of the Jussie Smollett case, victimhood chic.
Yep. And
that the stories that the press wants to tell are the hero-victim stories, but the victim's got to be right, just of the right persuasion, and the villain has to be just of the right persuasion.
Well, what a nice, easy way out for all of us. We care so much about the victims that that's what we do now. We elevate the victims, and we don't worry about the facts or being journalists. To me, that's a cop-out. I haven't read the whole article, so I could be speaking out of turn. But don't let us off so easily, right? It wasn't hard to do basic journalism on that story. It was right here and accessible. I mean, I was attacked, supposedly for not doing basic journalism on Benghazi, when none of the reporters who were writing about it and criticizing me and taking shots at me had any of the facts. And we were accused of not doing basic journalism just when we had signed a non-disclosure agreement, you know, that was written by the lawyers that many other journalists who had come before us had signed themselves. We were accused of that when the only two people that could have verified those two specific parts of our social story were in Libya, in a city that was under terrorist control and wouldn't speak to us.
Yeah, but
so in those circumstances, when you've verified everything else that you can, and you have no reason to believe someone is lying, and you go with it, you get accused of sloppy journalism. But those attacks were politically motivated, and there's politics in this too. It's politically motivated, and let's not delude ourselves, right? Let's just be honest. If we're in the business of calling it like it is, let's call it what it is. It's politics.
And I remember that story that you did, and one of the differences as compared to what we see today when the facts give lie to the reporting that was done is you took ownership of it. I remember you going on television and apologizing to the 60 Minutes audience for getting it wrong. And and that's fine. Everybody understands people make mistakes like that in the honest pursuit of their job. That's fine. And people are forgiving when you own it. You owned it, but the DC Press Corps today, as a matter of course, does not.
Well, they're not owning it, and I'm just, I'm a little surprised at how many mistakes are being made day after day after day. And so it makes you think that rush to judgment, that not independently verifying the information is being, is systematic more than just happening honestly, as was our case. An honest mistake was made. But I will tell you also in our case that when questions were raised about one of three characters in our story, the least important character, and I say questions were raised because what was out there was that his account differed from what he told the FBI. The FBI has never confirmed on the record what he said differently. We still don't know for sure. But he disappeared, and we couldn't defend him. What I will say, though, is the other two voices, the rest of our story, the parts I couldn't stand up for at the time, I'm standing up for now. Because it was the substance of our piece was in what those people said, and our piece was erased. Nobody can see it. Nobody can even see how bad the reporting on it was because they can't watch the piece and get the truth themselves. And that's not what I see happening today. Yeah, you have it out there, and you have people reluctantly even, putting a correction at the end of a story. Or, and you show a similar reluctance with the students that were on the steps of Capitol Hill who were attacked. And it just so happens to be that these two examples, show a liberal press making an assumption that served a political agenda that damns the right. I mean, I would defend the principle even if it were reversed. If it were the right-wing press or the conservative press going after liberal narrative and being wrong, I would say the same thing.
She is Lara Logan, former CBS News foreign correspondent. Lara, thanks so much for your time, and good luck with your future endeavors. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And she